Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. A very good morning, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. As we know, agriculture is facing growing pressure to reduce its reliance on the use of chemical nitrogen, not just from a cost perspective, but also to meet national and EU targets for greenhouse gas emissions, ammonia reductions, and improved water quality. And as a natural nitrogen fixer, white clover can significantly cut the need for synthetic fertilizer while maintaining and often improving pasture productivity and animal performance. And we're delighted to be joined this morning by Dr. Mike Egan, who's a research officer based in Teagasc in Moore Park. And Mike is going to be discussing the role of white clover on commercial grassland farms. So Mike has very kindly stepped in for, we had another speaker scheduled for this morning, and Mike has kindly offered to speak in place of that person on a different topic. So in case your reminders have shown a different topic, we will be discussing the role of white clover on commercial grassland farms this morning. So we'll hand over to you and we'll chat to you after the presentation.
White clover can be broken into two main benefits, animal and sward, and what we can get from that then in terms of, or what's causing those benefits. In the animal side, we can get increased dry matter intake of between 5 to 10%. Most of that is coming in the second half of the year. That increase in dry matter intake on an animal basis is being driven by an increase in overall feed quality. So typically when we look at white clover swards, as opposed to grass-only swards, we typically see a 2 to 3% higher or increase in crude protein concentration and a 4 to 5% reduction in fibre, particularly NDF concentration in the swards. And that as a whole is driving an overall increase in dry matter intake because of a faster breakdown in the rumen, because there's more protein and less fibre in the feed. And I suppose those two things combined is giving us an overall increase then in animal performance. And again, I'll show a slide in a minute, but we're typically getting between 10 to 15% increase in overall animal performance, whether it be on a dairy side or on a dry stock side with Philip Cretan in Athenry or Peter in Grange. I suppose in terms of the sward benefits, then we have seen increases in overall herbage production with the incorporation of legumes in swards. I suppose coming back to the environmental side, then we can significantly see declines or reductions in the need for chemical fertilizer use when we have sufficient clover content in the sward. And I suppose all of these combined together do relate to an overall reduction or an improvement in farm gate nitrogen surplus. So the amount of nitrogen that potentially is lost in the system. And we know on commercial farms, if we can reduce farm gate nitrogen surplus, there is a link with reduction in overall nitrate leaching, which is a key target going forward. So I suppose these are the benefits that we can get from white clover. And if we add all of these together or look at all these together, they can increase overall net profit. And on a dairy side, we can see somewhere in the region of 440 to 480 euro increase in net profit per hectare because of the reduction in chemical nitrogen and an overall increase then in animal performance as a result. But to get this benefit, and this is what I want to kind of delve into at the next bit, is we need to ensure we get all of these benefits. We need to ensure that we have enough clover content in the sward. And when we talk about getting these increases in performance, reductions in chemical fertilizer, and improvements in farm gate nitrogen surplus, we need to have at least 20, if not greater, average sward clover content in the sward. So that's typically lower in the spring, increasing into the late summer, and then falling off again later on in the year. And if we don't have that average 20% sward clover content, all of those benefits that I've just mentioned are greatly reduced then as a result. So if we look at here at the animal performance, and this is data from Moore Park, and we can see this red and blue line coming across the slide is daily milk solids yield from grass-only swards in the red line, and then cows grazing grass white clover swards here in the blue line. And you can see they're typically, in the first half of the year, they're typically fairly consistent in terms of where they are in terms of overall performance. All of the benefits that we get from having clover in the system in terms of an animal point of view typically occurs from late May to early June onwards, and that is maintained then for the remainder of the year. And coincidentally, that always coincides when we have, on average, and this green line here is the sward clover content, so the level of sward or proportion of clover we have in the sward across that grazing season, typically occurs when we have 20% average sward clover content. So we don't typically get massive benefits when we don't have sufficient levels of clover in the sward. And when we see here, we can get an increase of 40 kilos of milk solids, which equates to that 12 to 14% increase in overall performance on a per cow basis. So again, we can get significant benefits, but only when we have enough clover in the sward at the second half of the year. Again, if we look at an overall production point of view, again, we have the red line here in terms of daily growth rates from grass on these swards, and the blue line here, we have daily growth rates. This is grass growth rates from grass white clover swards. Typically in the spring, we get very little, if any, benefit up until that late May, early June period in terms of overall herbage production or daily grass growth rates. And again, most of the benefits on the sward point of view are occurring in that second half of the mid-season, kind of from mid to late June onwards. And we can see here, and this is data again from Moore Park, we can get an increase of about 12 kilos average growth rate from that early June period up until mid to late September. So again, significant benefits in terms of overall herbage production point of view. And we can see here when we have, again, just over 25% average sward clover content, a 7% increase in overall dry matter production from having clover in the sward on that. So it is very important that when we talk about clover and getting the benefits of clover, we have enough of it in the sward. And this is coming from the increase in herbage production and the increase in animal performance. But I suppose the next key driver of having clover in the sward is to be able to reduce chemical fertilizer use in that system and relying somewhat on the level of fixation or nitrogen fixation we have in the swards. Now, there's a huge range in the level of nitrogen that clover content or grass clover swards can fix. And there's a lot of factors that influence that, and I'll go through those in a minute. But all of the stuff that we have measured here, it can range, and again, this is a huge range, but can range from between 10 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year up to 185 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year. And again, a huge range. I'm not saying that happens all of the time, but again, there's a lot of factors that influence this on it. And again, we want to get an average of 20% and a peak of 45% in that kind of July, August period to be able to get as close to this 100 kilos plus fixation on a per hectare basis. So we look at actually what fixation is and what happens when we have biologic nitrogen fixation in the sward. So it's a symbiotic relationship between the white clover and the root nodules and the clover plant and the bacteria that is in the soil, or the rhizobia bacteria. So the white clover swards have to feed the bacteria, and the bacteria then provide the mechanisms to create that nitrogen fixation. So it is a symbiotic relationship is what that means. So the clover feeds the bacteria, and the bacteria then provide the capabilities to allow the root nodules to fix nitrogen or make nitrogen. So it is a symbiotic relationship, and there is nothing for nothing in this world. They benefit each other. But it is a huge energy requirement in terms of fixing nitrogen. So for every 1 gram or 1 kilo that nitrogen fixes, or the rhizobia provide fixation, the white clover plant or the clover plant needs to feed the bacteria energy or carbon. So it's a 1:6 ratio. So it's a very demanding process on the sward, on the white clover plant itself. And that's why typically when we apply large levels of chemical fertilizer, when we have legumes in the sward, we see a significant reduction in the level of fixation that we get, because it is a huge energy process on the white clover plant or any legume plant to fix nitrogen. It will use chemical nitrogen before it fixes nitrogen because of that energy demand. So if we want to get the best from it, we need to ensure that we don't oversupply nitrogen to the sward, so we maximize fixation, but don't starve it either at times of the year when we're not getting high levels of fixation from it again. So it's important to get that balance right in terms of the overall profile of when and how much nitrogen we apply to our grass clover swards. And that is completely dictated by the level of clover content that we have in our swards. So this is a typical when nitrogen supplies the clover. So this is a typical supply curve of nitrogen fixed per hectare per day from a grass white clover sward that has 23% average sward clover content. And again, this is the level of nitrogen fixed per hectare per day. So you can see here, if up until the 1st of May or the beginning of May, we're getting quite low levels of fixation, typically because we have lower soil temperatures than that. But it's somewhere between around 0.2 to 0.3 of a kilo of nitrogen fixed per hectare per day up until that May period. And then typically when we get into May and for the remainder of the year, we can see a significant increase of the level of fixation on a per hectare per day basis, typically peaking in July, August, which coincidentally coincides with the highest level of clover content that we have in swards at that time period. So if we can get here in between July and August, somewhere of 0.6, 0.7 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per day, on a 21-day rotation, that equates to about 13 kilos of nitrogen fixed over that period in a sward like that we have here, 23% average sward clover content. And so what that looks like on a month basis or across it, and if we mirror it with the level of sward clover content we have. So again, the red line here is the level of fixation that we're getting on a month basis. So I've just broken this into a month basis to coincide with the sward clover content. And then we have the level of clover. So the level of fixation can be fairly well predicted by the level of clover content that we have in our swards as we go across the year, as close as possible together. So again, we can see here we have quite low levels of sward clover content in that spring period up until that May-June period. And in line, we have low levels of fixation. So if we look at across this kind of 4-month period here, it's averaging somewhere around 10 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per month, per hectare over that 4-month period. And then as we go into the second half of the year, when we have higher sward clover contents, it's much higher. And what this graph equates to here is an average sward clover content of 23%, fixing somewhere in the region of 100 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year on that. So if we want to maximize the level of fixation and maximize grass growth rates as well in this, so we don't see a decline in grass growth rates, and we're building a nitrogen strategy in place, it's important to understand when we're getting that fixation and when we're not getting high levels of fixation inputs in it. In terms of the fixation side of it is the importance of sward clover content. So we can see here, and I mentioned earlier on, there's a huge range between 10 and 185 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare. That is really the level of clover in the sward has a huge impact on the level of fixation that we have. So we can see average sward clover content here along the bottom axis, and we can see the total kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year there on the y-axis. So again, as clover content increases, we see an inverse or direct line increase in the level of fixation that we're getting from clover. So it's not that a 10% sward clover content is not fixing nitrogen, it's just we have less plants in that sward, and as a total, they're fixing an overall less chemical or nitrogen fixation from that. When we talk about everything in terms of sward clover content, we want to target between 20 and 30% average sward clover content. And that will give us somewhere between an 80 to 100 kilos level of fixation per hectare per year when we can target that. So we can get the majority of the benefits from having clover in the sward in terms of a nitrogen fixation point of view. We also see that benefit in terms of the animal performance side of view as well, without having any of the major negative impacts when we go to significantly higher sward clover contents, peaking at 80 and 90%. That can cause issues for animals grazing as well. So again, this is the level of clover that we require in our sward to get that level of fixation that we need in that sward of up to 100 kilos of fixation. And all of that data then that we have, that I've just gone through in the last 4 to 5 slides, we have tried to develop a nitrogen strategy based on the level of clover and the time of the year that we have. So this is the nitrogen strategy for dairy farms, and the next slide is for dry stock farms. But this is the level, a nitrogen strategy based on the level of sward clover content that we have in our swards in spring, in that April period, because we know we get very low levels of fixation prior to that, and that's when we make that decision on how much nitrogen we apply from May onwards when we have that clover, and then we reduce that then in line with increasing sward clover contents. So most farmers, or most people that I'm talking to, when do we make that decision in terms of nitrogen fixation? It's very difficult to make that decision today because a lot can happen over the winter period, and we might not have the same level of clover that we have in our sward today or this year in that sward next year on it. So we need to make that decision in terms of how much nitrogen we spread and when we spread it, when we get to that kind of end of April, May period, when we're getting higher sward clover contents and higher level of fixation. So typically in a graph like this, we see very similar sward or chemical nitrogen fertilizer inputs up until that end of April period. And then we reduce chemical nitrogen inputs from May onwards in line with the level of clover content that we have in our sward in that April period. So if we have 5% of our clover content in our sward in April, we know we're going to get low levels of fixation based on the previous graph. So we're not reducing that nitrogen fertilizer as much as we would have if we had 15% sward clover content in our sward in April, and then we can reduce that in line going across the year. So yeah, it can sound a little bit more complicated, but if we want to get the best value of clover in our swards without reducing the level of or herbage that we're growing, we need to have tailored strategies in terms of nitrogen inputs based on the level of clover that we have in our swards at any one time point or any across the grazing season. And again, this is a similar graph then for dry stock systems. Again, much lower levels of overall nitrogen fertilizer inputs, but again, very similar process here in terms of the level of clover, reducing that nitrogen onwards as we go across the year for dry stock systems. So it's important to understand how much clover we have in our swards and then adjust the nitrogen as we go across it, as we go across the year first of all. So again, I've gone through kind of what is nitrogen fixation already, and you can see here the root nodules on the plant here. What I want to cover here is the factors that influence fixation. So there's a couple of key factors here that influence the level of fixation that we can get from our sward. Number one is the level of sward clover content, and I've shown that already in terms of the more clover we have in our sward, the higher level of fixation that we're going to get from it. Second point then is chemical fertilizer. Because of the energy demanding process, if we continue to apply high levels of fertilizer on grass white clover swards, the clover or even red clover swards, the clover will use that nitrogen itself rather than fixing, and it will actually reduce the level of sward clover content that we have in our swards as well. And then there is a number of climatic factors as well: sunlight, soil temperature, and rainfall. So white clover or legumes are Mediterranean plants by their nature, so they like warm, dry soil. So if we have very wet, waterlogged soils, we are going to reduce the level of clover we have and also reduce the level of fixation that we're going to get from our swards. We need high sunlight so we can make that carbon through photosynthesis to feed the rhizobia bacteria in the soil process. And then we need high levels of soil temperature. So typically we don't see clover growth rates below 8 degrees soil temperature, whereas grass will start to grow between 5 and 6 degrees soil temperature. But in terms of fixation, we need closer to 10 degrees plus to get significant levels of fixation in that sward again. So the climatic factors has a huge bearing here on what we have. And again, this is just the level of chemical, coming back to the chemical fertilizer point here. This is just as if we can look across, we have swards that are getting zero chemical fertilizer that are fixing over 200 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year. And as we increase the level of chemical fertilizer, we are reducing the level of fixation that we're getting from it. So where we have enough clover, we should maximize the fixation from that. And where we don't, we should apply chemical fertilizer in that. And again, I've showcased that one already, but this is just the climatic factor here. And the reason I've put this up here is just because of 2024, and there was a lot of negative press around white clover or legumes as a whole in 2024 that it didn't work. So I've already mentioned that legumes are temperate plants that like warm, dry soils and high solar radiation. So this is just the top graph here is the ambient air temperature for 2024, the summer of 2024. And we can see it might be hard to see on the slides here today, but there's kind of a purple line that runs along the middle. That is the previous 10-year average for that site. And anything that is blue or below that line is when the temperature in summer of 2024 was below the previous 10-year average. And anything that is red is when it was above the previous 10-year average. So the majority of last year's summer, we don't need to go back on what happened last spring and last summer, was very cold. So if we have a very cold spring and summer, we are inversely going to reduce the level of fixation that we're getting because of the lower soil temperatures. And then the bottom graph here is the exact same period, but for rainfall. And again, it's quite hard to see, but over the first 8 months of the year, 5 of the first 8 months of 2024 had above the average rainfall for the previous 10 years. So last year was very cold and very wet. And as a result, it didn't favor grass growth, but particularly didn't favor white clover growth or biological nitrogen fixation. So what we got away with in 2023, because it was quite a good year, it didn't necessarily happen in 2024. And that's why I put up that graph earlier with the nitrogen strategy based on the level of clover that we have. And that needs to be made on a year basis and an individual paddock basis based on the level of clover that we had, because we know last year didn't suit clover growth. We had lower levels of clover in the sward. We couldn't necessarily get away with the same things that happened in 2023 or even this year. Now, this is 2025 summer temperatures, and you can see all apart, 90% of the ambient air temperatures this year were above the previous 10-year average, with only two small little dips below that line. So this year compared to last year is very different years, and we had a much more conclusive year for clover growth and fixation as a result of the increase in temperatures and reduction in rainfall. I know some parts of the country got hit with a drought, but again, on average, it was a much more conducive year for legume and grass growth this year, and higher levels of fixation as a result. So that's kind of the fixation element dealt with in the nitrogen, and I'll come back to a little bit more on that in terms of what's happening on farms in a minute. But again, we need to have clover in swards, and to get it in swards, we need to be able to establish and maintain that high level of clover content in swards. And this is the time now for the industry to put a plan in place for individual farms and paddocks for next year. On paddocks, we're going to reseed and oversow and correct any soil fertility issues that we may have. So there's two methods that we are using for establishing clover on swards: reseeding and oversowing. Both work very well if done correct and at the right time of the year. Direct reseeding, there's nothing different from a grass white clover sward to a grass only sward. Soil fertility is vital at the time of sowing, not correcting it after sowing. So we need to have good soil fertility when we're establishing these swards. We need to have a minimum soil pH of 6.5 and index 3s and 4s for P's and K's. The biggest thing that we need to keep in mind then is the sowing rate. So we're talking about 1.5 to 2 kilos of white clover seed inclusion per acre, and that we don't bury that seed too deep, because the white clover seeds are very, very small and has a very low energy demand in that seed. So if we bury it too deep, it can penetrate up to the soil and won't be able to establish in that sward. The second process then is oversowing. I'm not going to go through these in a whole lot of detail. Oversowing can only happen at one time of the year, and that is early spring. April, very beginning of May. Once we get into May and June, we typically get low rainfall levels. And for oversown swards, we need soil moisture so that seed can penetrate down into that soil, because the soil hasn't been cultivated. It's not going to be able to penetrate down in through it. Again, we're going at a slightly higher seeding rate with oversowing swards, about 2.5 to 3 kilos per acre, or 5 to 6 kilos a hectare. And again, we need to target paddocks that have good soil fertility in those swards to ensure that we get it established and persistent. And the key thing after, whether with reseeding and oversowing, they're both managed the exact same there afterwards. We need to continually graze them, keep low pre-grazing covers and low residuals for the remainder of that year, to allow light down to the base of the sward, to allow that clover plants and grass plants to establish and tiller out and develop stolons as we go forward. And just in the impact of oversowing here, and I'll go on to the Clover 150 program then, but if we look at the impact of oversowing, and the reason we say April is the only time really for oversowing white clover into existing grass on these swards, it is paddocks that were as part of the Clover 150 program that were oversown in April versus oversown in May. The following year, so the 12 months afterwards, there was a 7% difference in average sward clover content. So paddocks that were oversown in April, average sward clover content of 21%. Paddocks that were oversown in May had an average sward clover content the following year of 14%. So it is important when we are oversowing that we get the paddock right, the soil fertility right, and the grazing management right, but the timing of when we're doing that. And if it gets too dry into May and into June, it reduces the success rate of that, and it's effectively a waste of money as we go forward. So leading on to what has all of that work has kind of led to is developing what is the Clover 150 program. So it is a program on grassland commercial farms across the country. And you can see the location of these farms on the map of Ireland here. And we've added new farms here in the northeast of the country over the last 2 years as well. But it is a commercial grassland farms establishing white clover onto these swards and trying to get it to persist long term. We have 5 key objectives of the overall program. Number 1 was to maintain herbage production at greater than 14 tonne. The reason we had 14 tonne is that's what the cohort of farms were doing prior to when we started this in 2021. Reduce chemical fertilizer across the board to less than 150 kilos, but again, depending on the level of clover that we have in our sward. Reduce the nitrogen surplus to less than 130 kilos, but again, driven by the chemical fertilizer reductions when we have sward clover content at 20% on 80% of the total area. So increasing clover content to the majority of the farm with greater than 20%. And the key point here is that we're maintaining farm feed self-sufficiency, that we're not taking out chemical fertilizer in the and reducing overall herbage production and having to rely on imported forage and concentrate to maintain that deficit going forward. So in terms of the establishment blueprint, in terms of what we have done, it is a targeted oversowing and reseeding program over a 4 to 5 year process, reseeding about 10% per year, oversowing about 10 to 15% per year, and then at the end of the 4 years having as close to 100% as possible, and then an ongoing process there afterwards to maintain clover in those swards. So the Clover 150 program has been going since 2021. So this is we're coming towards the end of the 5th year of the program. And we have, as much as possible with the cohort of 36 farms, tried to maintain this level of establishment blueprint and the nitrogen strategies that were developed earlier on in terms of the blueprints. So if we just look at the sward clover contents for the first 3 years in 2021, 22 and 2023, in spring, summer and autumn across the cohort of farms, we can see the green and the blue line here was 21 and 2022. We made good progress in getting clover on farms from where they were. 2023, we really increased the level of clover content that was on farms coming into autumn. If we look at then 2024, and this is what I was coming back to earlier on in terms of we need to adjust every year, because what happens in 2023 didn't carry through to 2024. So we ended the year in 2023, autumn 2023, with very high levels of clover on the cohort of farms. We had quite a wet and cold winter and spring, which reduced the level of sward clover content on these farms then in 2024. And it did recover by the end of the year, but in spring compared to in 24 versus 2023, there was an 8% reduction in sward clover content in April. There was a 3% reduction in June, and there was a 1% variation in autumn. So no difference in autumn. So it did recover to the exact same level in July and August last year, but the first 6 months of the year were extremely challenging because of the conditions that I've mentioned earlier on. So again, it's important to know the level of clover that you have in paddocks or on individual farms and adjust the level of nitrogen fertilizer. And if we did the exact same thing in 2023, in 2024 as we did in 2023, the spring, because of the great reduction in the level of clover, we would have reduced overall herbage production quite significantly if we didn't adapt to the level of clover that was on those swards. So this is and there's a lot of data here, I'm not going to go through it all, but this is where the group of farms are over the last 5 years and up until this year. Obviously, we're not finished this year yet. So when we started in 2020, there was less than 10% of the area had clover. There was less than 10% average sward clover content. They were spreading 232 kilos of chemical nitrogen, and they were growing 14.4 ton of dry matter per hectare. And we can see over the last 5 years, the progression that we have made in terms of the level of clover that we have on our farms. We're now just around 75% of the farmed area now has clover, averaging 22%. So we have achieved our target in terms of the level of clover that we want on the farm and the average level of sward clover content. But there has been huge variations and ups and downs in the level of herbage production more so, and a particularly drop here in 2022 because of the huge reduction in chemical fertilizer that was applied on these farms when we didn't have enough clover content. So if we look at the level of clover that we have here, we should have been spreading somewhere in the region of 180 to 190 kilos of nitrogen based on the level of clover. Fertilizer prices were extremely high in 2022, and a lot of the farms in the industry reduced chemical fertilizer, and it had a significant decline on average annual herbage production. That has been increasing over the last number of years, and this year to date, up until the middle of October, they have 12.8 ton year to date, and they're probably on target to do around 14 ton or close on 14 ton this year. So again, very close back on where we were or where we were targeted. 178 kilos of nitrogen spread year to date for this year, again, and down from 232 kilos when we started. So again, we have had significant improvements in that. We haven't done our nitrogen surplus again this year. We have to wait for the end of the year. But overall, the blueprint that we have developed has worked in terms of establishing clover on farm, getting enough clover nitrogen reductions, and maintaining herbage production. And this year, we will be back on track to do 14 ton dry matter per hectare per year by December of this year. However, if we look into that nitrogen surplus figures a little bit more detail, a worrying trend is when we see large reductions in chemical fertilizer usage here in this middle column here, when we don't have enough clover content in the swards. That's why it's very important when we have clover in our swards, we align the chemical fertilizer inputs to the level of clover. We don't want a situation that the industry are reducing chemical fertilizer significantly without having enough clover, reducing overall herbage production, as happened in the industry and somewhat on these farms in the early years, and filling that reductions in chemical fertilizer with nitrogen coming from external sources like concentrate and forages. So it's very important to get that balance right and a targeted application of nitrogen fertilizer when we have clover in our systems. So as a conclusion, there is now a successful blueprint for the incorporation of legumes on farms that we have now shown, and the nitrogen strategy worked around that. However, we do need a tailored nitrogen application strategy is required for individual farms, and we probably need to go to the next level now to have a tailored nitrogen strategy for individual paddocks based on the level of clover that we have. It is vital that nitrogen is only reduced when we have the appropriate level of clover in our sward, and that was seen in 2024 and 2022 when we didn't have enough sward clover content and we reduced chemical fertilizer. It had a significant negative effect on overall herbage production. So we have to be mindful that we marry those two things together. We don't oversupply nitrogen when we have enough clover, but we do supply nitrogen when we don't have enough clover. So it's important to that. 2024 was a challenging year for grass and also white clover, but 2025 has shown a significant promise in terms of overall increases in clover production and a regain in terms of overall herbage production on it as well. So there is always going to be fluctuations in the level of clover that we have in our swards and grass growths. However, we need to be able to manage what is in the individual paddock it to alter with the conditions that we're facing at the time. So we cannot do the same thing every year and in every paddock, and we do need to move to a more tailored nitrogen strategy and clover management strategy based on what we have in our individual paddocks. So thank you very much. Hopefully that wasn't too long, and if there's any questions, I'll take them now if Mark and Cathal want to come back.
Thanks, Mike. No, that was excellent, and it's always good to remind ourselves of some of the foundational messages there around clover, and that Clover 150 program definitely seems to be engaging, and that's what we want to see, is that what it looks like in real life scenarios. Lots and lots of questions coming through here, so do use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen if you want to submit a question here for Mike this morning. Mike, it just struck me, all the conversations about nitrogen, and we have tests for phosphorus and potassium and trace elements and so on, and we don't have a test as such for nitrogen. Or is there something available there for farmers, or something in the pipeline there to try and get a fix on, given that
I missed the very first part of that question, Mark, sorry.
Yes, Mike, the line is your line is breaking up a little bit, but I was just saying,
I might turn off my camera just to...
Okay. I was just saying about the how you were saying how important it is to get that balance right in terms of the amount of nitrogen that's in the system there. Is there anything coming down the tracks or available to farmers to try and assess that level of nitrogen that's there in the system?
Yeah, so the challenge with that is that when you test it, at the moment there's not, Mark, and there is different products there to test chlorophyll levels and nitrogen levels in the sward, and it's used widely in tillage sectors as well. The problem with that in grass systems, with the fertilizer spreaders and the scanners, is when it is applied after grazing, it's very difficult to tell where the high levels of nitrogen are to get that tailored nitrogen strategy. So at the moment, there is work being undertaken to try and develop that. In terms of the trace element point of view, I think, yes, there is definitely work to be done on that. But I think as an industry, there is far more significant benefits to be got by increasing soil pH and increasing phosphorus and potassium levels on it. Like if we look at dairy farms as a total in 2024, 24% of soils tested were optimal for PK and lime, or pH, potassium, phosphorus, and soil pH. So if we're at 24% optimum, we know we need soil pH of 6.5 and index 3s and 4s, so P's and K's. I think that's where we need to focus on first before we go after the trace elements. And farmers that are there can then look at the trace element. Boron is very important. Sulfur is very important for clover systems. But I think there's easier wins to be got just yet. But in terms of the nitrogen testing on farms, not yet. I think the easiest tool for commercial farms is to have an idea of the level of clover that's in the swards. There's scorecards there on the Teagasc website that can help with that and aid with that. And as these new technologies come in place, they can come onto farms in.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Lots and lots of interest in your presentation this morning. We've huge numbers on this morning as well, and even all the way from Australia, Mike. So you're gone international. um, Cathal, lots of really good questions coming through there.
Yeah, some interesting questions coming in from Mike. And just to start off on one that you kind of touched on, but it's a big one for farmers is in that springtime when cow demand is high, is there anything that we can do to improve clover content or the contribution in spring?
Yeah, so like if we look at what from an agronomic point of view, what clover wants and clover needs. Clover wants warm soils. We can't really control that. It wants not waterlogged soils. We can't really control that, and it needs light. The only thing we can control in terms of those climatic factors is the light to the sward. So tight grazing, removing heavy covers in spring. So we shouldn't really be carrying very heavy covers into March. So again, we need to achieve our opening farm cover targets, but we need to ensure that our residuals are kept tight. We allow light down to the base of the sward, even when we have lower soil temperatures at that time of the year. By allowing light down to the base of the sward, it can allow the plant to start fixing or potentially fixing earlier, but to develop stronger stolon networks because of that photosynthesis down into the swards. That and avoiding pugging and poaching. And it's not that clover or nitrogen kills clover. There's kind of a metric on there that nitrogen kills clover. It can if you oversupply it. When clover swards are not fixing high levels of nitrogen, particularly in that colder, wetter periods in the spring, the addition of nitrogen, some level of nitrogen during that point can aid clover growth as well. Because if we don't, the clover plant itself can become disadvantaged and reduce the level of sward clover content. Again, I'm not saying we apply higher levels of it, but we do need some levels of nitrogen and some of that can be met with slurry and P and K as well early on, but avoiding pugging and poaching and grazing it early and avoiding high swards and high residuals.
Yeah, and just when you mentioned light, there's another comment around increased interest in agroforestry, and it has multiple benefits to our animals and our farms. But is there something we have to keep an eye on, maybe to manage the shading, or is that an issue? Because you still have plenty of grassland area. There won't be that much light reduction, I'm sure.
And look, it depends on where they are and how much it is like, but yes, and even with agroforestry, you're still going to get light penetration to the base of the sward somewhat on it. If there's higher levels of agroforestation, residuals at that time point are even more key, more vital to ensure that whatever shading is coming from trees, that we don't allow any shading from poor residuals or high covers.
Yeah. Mike, one that always comes up is nitrate leaching. Obviously, we have a big problem down the south and southeast, and we're trying to get on top of it. And part of your Clover 150 project is trying to help with that. People always ask the question, and it's been brought up several times: Does clover contribute to nitrate leaching, or is it safer than the bag?
It's a very hard question to answer directly, but yes and no is the short answer. Like, nitrogen is fixed from clover, and that nitrogen is used then by the sward, the clover plant, and the companion species, namely perennial ryegrass, to grow. But that's not to say that if that grass plant doesn't use that nitrogen that's been fixed, we won't get some level of runoff or potential leaching from it. The real benefit of having legumes in the sward is that it is not it's a slow release nitrogen. If you look at that levels of nitrogen that's been fixed on a per hectare per day basis that I showed earlier on, the maximum amount we're getting is 0.6 of a kilo in spring or in July and August. So we get much levels rather than going with 30 kilos of nitrogen and we get 2 inches of rainfall 3 days afterwards. That has a significant more negative impact. So yes, it can. We can show that we're reducing farm gate nitrogen surplus. There's a direct link with farm gate nitrogen surplus and improving or reducing nitrate leaching. But legumes can play a role, maybe not huge, but they can play a small role on it, as long as we get the balance right. So I mentioned earlier on, I mentioned numerous times throughout it, 20-25% average sward clover content in the sward. If we have excessively high levels of clover in our sward, we go up to that 70 and 80% peak sward clover content. What happens then is we don't have enough grass in the sward to use that nitrogen. So we need to get that balance right between the two of it in the grass component of the sward and also in the clover component of the sward, so that if there is excess nitrogen being fixed by the legumes, that there's a grass species there to utilize that nitrogen that's been fixed. So it's a very hard question to answer directly, but there is benefits of having it clover in the sward in terms of a water quality point of view, if we reduce chemical fertilizer when we have it.
Yeah, and just on that, it's the big thing I suppose on that is it easy to assess the amount of clover in your sward, and do we need to be out walking the paddocks and the farm and grass measuring to make those timely decisions on whether it needs a little tickle of nitrogen or not?
Yeah, so like we definitely need to be out in the paddocks and measuring the level of grass, and because even at the level of grass, we can alter our chemical fertilizer input based on the level of grass that we have. With too much grass, we can reduce back nitrogen inputs into it as well. But I think we can get overcomplicated in terms of, is it 17.5% sward clover content or 21% sward clover content? I think we can get overcomplicated in that way. I think what we've broken down into 0, low, medium, and high. And paddocks that are medium and high levels of sward clover content that are 20% plus in the sward, they are quite easy to assess. They are the paddocks that we can get the significant savings on in chemical fertilizer. We know paddocks that have less than 5% that are not going to contribute any level of nitrogen fixation, really. So it is a little bit more complicated to assess it, but there is scorecards there. I think Mark has put it into the chat, the establishment guide, that the scorecards in the back of it. But we definitely need to be walking our paddocks. I have said April is the key time point that we need to make that first decision. There's probably 3 time points that we need to make that decisions. April is the first one when we're starting the second grazing rotation. After all that herbage has been removed from the first round. Then July and then August before we go with our final round of fertilizer. And if we get those 3 time points and divide it into low, medium, and high, it's a little bit easier then to tailor that nitrogen strategy based on that.
Yeah. I think the more
but you have to walk in your paddocks.
Yeah, and that information gives farmers confidence to make the decision. Yeah. There's a question here, and I come across as well. Why is it sometimes when you oversow or you put in some clover that paddocks right beside each other, same soil, same management, that they have variation?
Yeah. I get this all the time, and there's probably no easy answer without going to a full analysis on it. Like, soil fertility is key, number one. If 2 paddocks are side by side and everything is the same, timing, everything else, and there's a difference in soil fertility, poor soil fertility will most definitely reduce the level of clover that's going to get, particularly in oversown swards, because of the competition from grass. There is other factors there too as well on it. Is there slightly more compaction in it? It's very difficult for the roots to penetrate down through the soil if there's a slight compaction issue in some paddocks. And without seeing those paddocks, I think the biggest thing that's been got at soil fertility is the grazing management. And oversowing can work very well, and the Clover 150 program has shown that it works very well, and the commercial farm is doing it across the country very well. There is a slight more variation with it, and we're not always going to get 100% success rate with it. But when we get the right paddock, the right timing, and when I mean the right paddock, soil fertility and open swards, clover in oversown swards, in dense swards does not work. And then our grazing management afterwards, it probably needs to be grazed 3 times for the first month, and then it should not go above 1100. If we can get all of those things right, we'll reduce the variation, but that's not to say it's not going to work. It'll work in 3 paddocks and not in 1. There's other factors there too, and it's very hard to say what's causing that. But I think if we get all those other things right, we can still get a 60 to 70% success rate with it plus.
Could I just ask you around just the overall adoption of nitrogen or of clover use across the country? Are there, just interested in your views there in terms of how the uptake of clover is across the country, and how can we support it better, or are there barriers there that farmers are experiencing when it comes to clover adoption, or is there any advice you can offer around that whole space?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing is the only data that we can get really, there's a couple of on-farm clover programs that we can see the level of clover that's coming in on farms. This one, there's a few other ones as well. But I suppose that the only metric that we have really is clover seed sales, white clover and red clover seed sales. And if we look back to I have the slide there, I didn't put it into the presentation today, but if we look back to 2012, 2013, we're bringing in somewhere in the region of 110 to 115 ton of white clover seeds per year at that time point. In 2022 and 2023, that increased to 416 ton. So there was a significant increase in the white clover seed sales over the last 10 years. Now, most of that happened from 2021 and 2022 onwards, when fertilizer prices went to plus €1,000 a ton. Now, the promising thing is that seed sales figures have remained high, even when fertilizer prices have reduced. If we look at red clover seed sales back in 2010, 2011, there's about 6 ton of red clover seed sales coming in. That has now gone to 100 ton. With the red clover scheme and the multi-species scheme as well. So there has been significant improvements or increases in the level of white clover seed that has been imported and sold in the industry. How we ensure that happens and they get the benefit from it, I think it is the programs like this program and the other on-farm clover programs showcasing how farmers use it and use those farmers then as test beds going forward to do that. And every year on the Clover 150 programs, we hold a series of regional walks using the Clover 150 farmers, bringing farmers in and showcase that. And then we have the Clover mornings, or they're called as well, run with Grass 10 throughout that. So programs like that showing peer-to-peer learning is where it works. And there are times that there is a fear sometimes around reducing nitrogen and reducing herbage production, and also issues with bloat as well, that is there in the back of people's minds. And if we can answer those questions for farmers, get farmers to show other farmers how to manage those and incorporate into it, we can get significant buyback. And I think, like, if we look at the seed sales and nitrogen usage sales, okay, slightly back up last year, but we are getting benefits and showing improvements with having clover on the system.
No, that was some spike in those years, wasn't it? That 2018 was our 2020.
Yeah, and look, 2022 helped clover a lot.
Yes.
2022 helped clover a lot with fertilizer prices.
Yeah, and of course, I suppose farmers would have gotten confidence from that, and seen the results of using it. So yeah, sometimes we do need those shocks to the system to make that change. Yeah. Thanks for that, Mike.
Yeah,
Mike, there's a number of questions around red clover and the ability to fix nitrogen compared to white. And I know you're talking about white, and I suppose there's a couple of questions around: should we stick with white clover and grazing swards alone, or could we potentially mix a bit of red in there as well, or what's the best strategy?
Yeah, so, okay, the first part of that question in terms of the fixation from red clover sward. So I showed the levels of fixation that we can get from white clover swards. It's typically on average around 100 to 120 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year. Red clover swards can fix significantly more than that, over 200 kilos of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year plus. And there's a much higher limit in terms of fixation from that. So yes, red clover can add huge savings in terms of nitrogen fixation. If we look at white clover and red clover, white clover is bred and was bred for grazing swards, and red clover is and was bred for silage production swards. So in red clover, in grazing swards, has a much lower level of persistency as a result. Because of the way it grows, white clover has stolons that grow along the ground. Red clover has a central taproot and individual plants that grow up and they don't tiller out or stolon out as a result. So even if you do put a red clover into swards, and we've seen it in the multi-species schemes, it's gone after 12 to 18 months and probably sooner in some cases. You'll always get individual paddocks that will remain longer, but by and large, it will be gone after 12 to 18 months in grazing swards. So I would be of the opinion that we should keep white for grazing, what it was intended for, and red for silage swards. When you put red and white into a seed mixture together, levels to managing legume swards or grazing swards, and now you're gone to a seed inclusion of 1.5 to 2 kilos of white clover included, and all of a sudden you're going up to 3 to 4 kilos of red and white included in the seed mixture, it can result in very, very high levels of legumes in that sward in that first 12 to 18 month period, and can cause issues in terms of the management around it. So I think for starting off, I think we should keep it for white clover swards for grazing, and red clover side for silage swards. And like, I haven't touched on red clover for silage swards, but there is huge benefits of having red clover included in silage production swards with zero levels of nitrogen and maintaining very high levels of production in that sward.
Yeah, just on the leaf type as well, a lot of farmers will be always asking, there's a few questions here about, the size leaf for clover, the different varieties, big leaf versus small or medium. What's your recommendations?
Yeah, so when I started in Moore Park, first it was there's three leaf size categories. First of all, sorry, the small, medium, and large leaf size categories for white clover. That has now changed. So there's a very small leaf white clover, small, medium, large, and now there's a very large leaf, two very large leaves on the recommended list. I suppose the first thing historically is small was always suited for sheep grazing systems because they're slightly more persistent, or they were perceived to be more persistent. Medium was suited to ruminant, dairy, and beef grazing systems, and large is more suited to red. I suppose there has been huge improvements in breeding, and all of the work we have done here so far isn't showing that the expected differences that we've seen in leaf size categories. There's currently work going on to develop a clover index similar to the pasture profit index. And the top 5 varieties on the prototype are a mixture between small, medium, and large. So I don't think they're the same differences there. There's probably bigger variation even within leaf size category than across leaf size category with off the recommended list. There is a lot of cultivars sown over the last number of years that weren't on the recommended list. So always select off the recommended list and know what you're sowing. There's some varieties now, or some seed mixtures are being sold now with just white clover blend, and you don't even know what cultivars or varieties are included in it. So always know what's in it, select off the recommended list, and the new research would suggest that there isn't the same variation between leaf size as once suggested.
Yeah, a couple of questions around keeping, I suppose, weeds out of the pastures and what are the sprays like now at the moment to try and keep our clover in without and keep those noxious weeds out?
Yeah, so look, there's only at the moment there's only one licensed herbicide product for white clover swards. Since the since the 2,4-DB was taken off the market about 4 years ago, there was a derogation granted on that for about 3 years. I did work here to grant that with the department. While there was no other alternative there, a new alternative came on the market last year, 2024, called Pro Clova, and now that is the only licensed product that is available for white clover. Established and establishing swards. Now, Eagle is there, or sorry, not Eagle is there, sorry, for established swards. It can't be used on reseeded swards. So Pro Clova is the only product that is licensed at the moment for establishing or new reseeds in white clover swards. Now, if you look at the back of that list, there's recommendations that need to be got in terms of timings, air temperature, buffer zones, and low drift nozzles. And when you use all of those recommendations, and it's important to read the recommendations on every herbicide that has been applied, whether it's clover safe or not, it's important to follow the recommendations of it because that allows the best outcome then from that herbicide product. In terms of red clover swards, Pro Clova is not licensed for new reseeded red clover swards. It is only licensed for established swards, so once they're 12 months of age. So the derogation has been granted for 2,4-DB for red clover last year, 2024, and this year, 2025, for newly reseeded red clover swards, and you have to have receipts shown that red clover was sown for silage swards on that, and that was only granted for 120 days, which. And the derogation ended this year at the end of September. So there's only one product for white clover swards at the moment for reseeded, and the derogation is there for 2,4-DB for reseeded red clover swards. But it's just the one thing I'd say that it's important to look at all recommendations on all herbicides when you're applying them and follow them.
Okay, Mike, we're at the end of our session now. Lots and lots of good questions coming through from our audience. And just to I suppose, direct people towards the Teagasc website, there are a huge amount of resources available there. We just put in a link there to some of the resources there around establishing clover, and lots of videos as well. And there are a few other podcasts available as well that discuss the establishment of clover. So, Mike, really appreciate your time, and thanks for stepping in at the last minute. You gave us a few scary moments there with your signal during the session, but I think the message came across loud and clear. I just want to share details of a really important conference taking place next week. It's the Water Quality Conference, and it's taking place in the Killinard Heritage Hotel in Killinard, County Laois, on the 29th of October. Cathal, you're closely involved in this conference. Could you tell us a little why people should head along to it?
Yeah, look, Mark, we're trying to improve our water quality across the country. We have really good speakers from all the way from policy to regulation, all the way through to practical implementation on the farm, how to fix the problem. We've really good solutions out there. It's just a matter of getting the adoption and getting people into the room. And this is a really good opportunity to see, what's the cutting edge in technology and processes where we can solve the problems, and to hear about our water quality situation in Ireland. And it's fixable, Mark. We just have to, get to the job and do it.
And next week, we're going to be joined by Dr. David Wall and Cathal Redmond, who's an advisor with Teagasc, and we're going to be discussing increasing the precision of nutrient use in tillage and tools and technologies to achieve that. So do join us next week for that presentation from David and Cathal. So until then, Mike, thanks again for joining us this morning. You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.